thank you very much to the Abu Dhabi Department of Culture and Tourism, and I'm very happy to be here and to meet all these colleagues and friends, some since I began to work in Abu Dhabi. And we've been speaking about animals, we've spoken about sediments, and now it's time for plants, and I will speak about archaeobotany. And archaeobotany is an expanding field of studies in Abu Dhabi. Archaeobotany, the study of plant remains from archaeological sites. Expanding field because there are many new excavations and many new studies, so putting more points on these maps of archaeobotanical studies that are not completely exhaustive, but with the main studies that have been done. And what you can see is the situation is very, very different according to the regions. And of course, the archaeobotanical studies are completely linked to the archaeological work that has been carried out in Abu Dhabi, in the Emirates, and in the Arabian Peninsula in general. And in fact, from the Neolithic period, we have very few studies, very few remains, mainly along the coast, and only one single site in the interior of the Oman Peninsula at Al-Buhais. The Bronze Age, we have also mainly sites in the Oman Peninsula and some in southwestern Yemen. And then for later periods, Iron Age, classical antiquity, and the Islamic period, we have again sites in the Oman Peninsula, southwest Yemen. But also recently, there have been quite a lot of excavations in Saudi Arabia, northwestern Arabian Peninsula, and also in the desert interior of Saudi Arabia with new sites, more recent sites with very interesting information, and also harbor sites, port sites from the Islamic period along the coast of the Arabian Peninsula that will bring us new data soon. It's time now, when we have a certain amount of studies, it's maybe time now to start a sort of revision of this material, and if the field is expanding and we have a lot of new information, there are also some problems in the archaeobotanical field. The material is often very badly preserved and not very abundant. There are problems of identification because much of this material is preserved just as impressions. The early material is just plant impressions in mud brick, for example, and it's very difficult to identify, with some problems of identification that I will come back to in a moment. And there are also problems of dating of many of these remains. They are not directly dated, and it's difficult to say exactly to what period they are dated. And I have just experienced that by myself very recently. Cotton seeds that were published by me and colleagues as being from the Achaemenid period in Bahrain have been directly dated, in fact, date to the 13th century AD. So that can happen, and that can probably happen with a lot of different remains when they are directly dated, and that's what should be done in most cases. So the agriculture production in Arabia is later than in neighboring regions in the Middle East. And we have very early agriculture in the Near East, of course, and southern Mesopotamia, on the Iranian plateau. And in Arabia, agriculture arrives very late, in the late 4th or in the early 3rd millennium BC. And this, of course, appears very normal if you look at the hydrological situation, with not sufficient rainfall and also no permanent rivers to draw for irrigation. So the arrival of agriculture is absolutely dependent on the irrigation technology. And when agriculture appears in Eastern Arabia and in the Oman Peninsula, it seems it appears in a well-known form that we know from southern Mesopotamia and also from the Iranian plateau. It's the date palm garden, the traditional date palm garden that is still quite emblematic for the region. And this traditional agri-system is what we would call a typical polyculture agri-system, when you have the association of different plants, both in space and in time. In space, because you have the combination of both lignous plants, perennial plants, annual plants in the same plots. And you have also a combination of winter and summer crops, different types of plants that are cultivated in a rotation in time. So you can have one harvest or two harvests or several harvests in the same year, where the different plant species are succeeding each other. And the difference between winter plants, what we'd call winter crops, and summer crops, it's not linked to taxonomy or systematics. You can find summer crops and winter crops in different botanical families, but it's a question of functioning, seasonality, and the way they grow, their growth cycle. And in fact, the winter crops they like some cold weather, and they need to flower before the summer solstice, and they are usually sown in autumn, October, for example, and harvested in spring in April, May. And they rely on winter rains in temperate climates, and they originate from the temperate regions, from cooler regions more to the north. And the summer crops, on the contrary, they like hot weather. They rely on summer rains, and they come from subtropical or tropical regions. And they have a shorter life cycle, generally, sometimes just 100 days. That means 3 months. You can sow them in May, for example, and you harvest them in July. And that could, of course, be very interesting, because you can combine the two, and you can, on the same agricultural fields, you can cultivate one after another and have a double harvest in this case. But of course, you need water, and in areas where you have both winter rains and monsoon rains, like in India, some regions in India, you can have double cropping easily. But of course, in the Arabian Peninsula, you will need irrigation. But if you have enough water, of course, it's completely possible to have a double cropping system with a succession of 2 different seasons of growing, one after another. And we know there were irrigation systems, of course, since antiquity. So the Arabian Peninsula is very well situated and has always been between different agro-biodiversity regions, between tropical and subtropical Africa, with several species that were cultivated in these areas, like sorghum, millets, African pulses, and others. And on the other side, India, with the tropical crops of different types, like rice, for example, most well-known, but millets, pulses of Indian origin that were domesticated in this area, or cotton, for example, the Asian cotton, and we have the African cotton in the African subcontinent. And then we have, of course, a temperate Near Eastern plant diversity region to the north, with wheat, barley, and other common plants. So the Arabian Peninsula is just in the middle of these different agro-biodiversity regions or spheres, and could have received plants from different kinds and different traditions, agriculture traditions, that were initiated much earlier in these surrounding regions. And these to know which were the origins of these plants is, of course, interesting. It's interesting in itself to know which were the plants that were cultivated, but also to know the origins, because in some cases these plants can bear witness to exchange, trade, influence, introduction of new plants, and cultural interaction between the different regions. And the first claim for the presence of a summer crop in Arabia is maybe also the earliest claim is also maybe the most spectacular. It was published in 1982 in several articles by Serge Closiou and Lorenzo Constantini, who both stated or published the first evidence of the date palm agriculture system, or ACES agriculture, and also spoke the first about the presence of a summer crop, sorghum. And in fact, this sorghum, what was identified as sorghum, was documented through seeds, but that have never been published, but also, and especially, through imprints on mud brick, in the mud brick that was used to construct the buildings at Hilli 8 in the early 3rd millennium. You can see some of these mud bricks here. Some of them were mud brick impressions, some of them were published, and others got the slides directly from Serge Closiou. And these were thus identified as sorghum. And you can understand this identification, because if you look at the seeds of sorghum down to the right, these seeds are like roundish and like globular. And what the impressions that you can see look like sorghum too. And sorghum is a real summer crop. It's one of the most important cereals cultivated presently, originate from tropical, subtropical Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. And you can see its distribution today of wild sorghum, probably cultivated or domesticated in Eastern Africa in the 4th millennium BC. We have traces of sorghum also in India very early, from the 3rd millennium BC, on several sites, and Arabia is situated exactly in the middle. So there's no reason that sorghum should not be present at Hilli in the 3rd millennium BC. And that would also be specifically interesting from a point of view of cultural context between Africa, Arabia, and India, and Hilli might have been a point in the middle in this international network. But the problem with this attestation of sorghum is, the only problem, if I would say, is that it's not sorghum from a botanical point of view. And you can see here the impression to the left is one of the impressions from Hilli. That's very clear. It's a very nice impression, in fact. In fact, the problem is that the morphology of this doesn't correspond to the morphology of sorghum, because sorghum is a grass species that has got multiple branches branching. So there's a main branch, and then there are secondary branches. And on each of these secondary branches, you have a double 2 seeds that are together like this, and you have the two spikelets here. And as you can see on this imprint, you have only one element here on each stalk. So it's not the morphology of sorghum. And this might look like a spikelet, a grain of a cereal, but in fact, it could be something else. So the question is, what is it then? And in fact, my colleague, archaeobotanist George Wilcox, has a very good suggestion. And here you see the archaeological sorghum from Hilli to the left. In the middle, you have a modern imprint of a herbaceous plant, which is from the lily family called Asphodelus. And you have the modern plant to the right. And in fact, here the morphology corresponds perfectly to the imprint, modern imprint, and also to the archaeological imprint. So we can suggest, or almost be sure, that this is the sorghum that is not sorghum from Hilli. So it's another plant. It's an Asphodelus. It's a lily. And this plant is a common commonly growing on sandy and silty soils, a common weed of cultivated fields. And it's what is even more interesting is that it's present not only as imprints, but it's also present as carbonized seeds on several sites. For example, was discovered at Hilli 8 from last year's excavation, and also at Bat and Mleha in Sharjah. So it was a common plant that you can find on archaeological sites at different periods, and probably growing in the cereal fields or in the fields in general in the past as it does today. And then we can ask the question, why is it an imprint in the mud brick? And in fact, it was probably reaped or harvested with the cereals. So the cereals were probably cut on the ground level. And then it was brought in with a straw that was used as a temper in the mud bricks. And that's why we can find it as an impression in the bricks at Hilli. And we have also from somewhat later periods, mostly or almost exclusively Near Eastern winter cereals, like different wheat species, barley. Barley is present on all sites. It's an important cultivated crop. And even if we have some sorghum and millets in Eastern Africa, in the Arabian Peninsula, really barley and wheat are predominating. What is interesting is to see that there's a difference between the southern part of the peninsula with some emmer wheat, for example, and there's a similarity between this region and Eastern Africa, Ethiopia, and of course these regions are very close contact and have similarities also in the agro-biodiversity or agricultural assemblages. And the rest of the peninsula is really naked wheat, free-threshing wheat, bread wheat type that is dominating generally. And the first summer crop that's attested with certainty is probably sesame. that's been found on several sites, and sesame comes from India. It's domesticated in the Indian subcontinent. It's found in India in the 3rd millennium BC. We can find it in Pakistan, also in 3rd millennium. Southern Iraq, Abu Salabir in the 3rd millennium. It's not very common. It's found in small quantities and rarely, but we have some examples in the Arabian Peninsula in the mid or later part of the 2nd millennium at Kalat al-Bahrain, and then in a storeroom in Sabir in southwestern Yemen. So for the moment, sesame seemed to be it's an oil plant, of course, seemed to be the first summer crop that's surely attested. A little bit later, in the late pre-Islamic and classical periods, summer crops are much more common, and what we can see in general in the oasis agriculture context, there's much more diversity. This is probably due to more diversity in general, but also to better preservation conditions and sometimes exceptional preservation conditions, such as Mleha, where there's a burnt building. And what we can see now is the diversification in fruit trees, with many fruit trees or several fruit trees from the Mediterranean or Near Eastern sphere, like pomegranate, olive, figs, grapes, everywhere. And then we have also summer crops like millets, Indian pulses, and cotton and pepper and rice. So there's a general diversification with plants coming in mostly from India, probably. And if some of these plants cannot be cultivated in Arabia, like pepper, because pepper needs very humid conditions, others could perhaps have been cultivated, and we can use different arguments for local cultivation, like ecological conditions. The temperatures are sufficient in this context, presence of irrigation systems, and also examples of traditional cultivation. We have examples of rice cultivation in date palm gardens, for example, in Saudi Arabia, and also in southern Pakistan in similar climatic conditions. Cotton also has been cultivated historically in date palm gardens. So it's completely possible that they were here. And also archaeological arguments, because if we have a lot of seeds, if they are very common in different contexts, and we have an example here from Madain Sahle in Saudi Arabia, we have cotton in different contexts at the site, and they are very common, which probably indicates that they were cultivated locally. And you can also have other parts of the plants or other items that are linked, for example, to textile production, such as cotton textiles and spindle whorls and so on. And cotton is a specifically interesting plant because it's a plant that's used in the craft industry and perhaps also used in exportation. It's a cash crop. It's a crop that's not only for subsistence but also for economically important. And there's evidence that Arabia, the Arabian Peninsula, and the date palm gardens in the Arabian Peninsula were probably production areas for cotton production and maybe exportation also, together with India, that's the traditional cotton producer, but also Arabia, Eastern Arabia, and also Madain Sahle, and Egypt also. So there are several cotton producing areas in the antiquity, in the Middle East, and probably an economically important product. And in the Islamic period, we have summer crops on most sites. Rice is common, perhaps locally cultivated or not. It's difficult to say because we have much evidence for portuary sites from ports. And just to finish, in these date palm gardens, we can see it's a very dynamic system where we have the introduction of different types of plants that come from different origins at different periods, and change the traditions and also change the society in the production, and also the development of cash crops or commercially interesting crops. And here, to finish, my co-authors, Vladimir Dabrowski, who is a PhD student, and Charlene Bouchot. Thank you very much.